So good morning, and next time I'm going to have to bribe Cheryl not to give me the slot right before lunch. Definitely. We'll move this along and try to get you out of here. So I think in today's progression, we're at that point where we've had some excellent science presentations this morning, and we're going to turn our attention now to specific applications of these concepts in the NEPA process. And I'm going to talk about that, and then we'll continue that this afternoon with some specific project examples. So I don't know over the years how many times I've talked to a forest staff officer or a silviculturist or a fuels planner, and they'll tell me in exasperation, I don't need another tool, I don't need another paper, show me how it all fits together. So I'm going to try to do that here for at least one example. Talk about some of our legacy and building blocks over the years, the need for a set of departure estimates covering the entire region, developing these estimates, and then refining that as we go along. So as you may know, in the ecology program, we have a legacy of potential vegetation described by plant associations. This was in response to the clear-cutting controversies of the late 70s, and it was at a local scale. And those publications are available, hard copy and online on EcoShare. A tremendous amount of work done over about 15 or 20 years. So in the late 80s, landscape ecology was really emerging as a profession. The famous Franklin and Foreman paper in 1987 about staggered setting clear cutting. And these set the stage for the Northwest Plan and the Interior Columbia assessment, which have already been talked about. To also support this planning effort, a substantial body of state and transition modeling was developed to describe serial stages over time. And by using this modeling, we can describe that range of variation or the reference conditions that Summer talked about. This was used extensively in forest planning as they began to implement the Northwest Plan using the Vegetation Dynamics Development Tool, which has evolved today to ST-SIM. And currently our program is collating these and revamping and upgrading them. The recent substantial body of work in Westside Fire, for example, is probably going to require revising those models. So the 1994 Northwest Plan and then the companion 1996 East Side screens really led to a transition away from a timber-dominated paradigm. And then the fires started. Well, of course, the fires were always there, but they began to increase in frequency and severity in the late 90s. So we needed an assessment tool to figure out how to deal with this in a planning context as the acres burned steadily crept upward as we approached 2000. And I think the fires in Idaho and Montana in 2000 were a real tipping point for action there. So we needed an ecological metric to get some grasp in a quantitative way on this departure from the natural range that Summer described. How far are you away? How far out of whack are you, if you will? And we made the assumption that pre-settlement landscapes prior to European settlement had all their components and were functioning. So therefore they were sustainable. So how do we describe, here's the nuts and bolts. This is how it all fits together. So you need a framework to describe fire regimes. Well, you can get that directly from potential vegetation. And you can model through the state and transition modeling, you can get the pre-settlement conditions, and that's the reference conditions. And has been mentioned, I think Karen mentioned it, we do have a new current potential vegetation map. I notice now this is at broad scale. Potential veg can be mapped really at any scale. And so we've evolved out of that local site orientation towards a more landscape perspective. And this provides the framework for mapping fire regimes because you can take each of those potential veg types and tie them to the frequency and severity of fire. So now you have a grasp on this. The reference conditions includes two basic sets of information, one on the set of cirral stages and their historic abundance. And where do we get that? We get that from the state and transition modeling. And then the characteristic frequency and severity. Where do we get that? Mostly from expert knowledge. If you have good fire atlas information, you can get quantitative about that. You can also use tree ring data in that to get the frequency and severity. And I'm sure you've all seen this slide or something similar many times, the set of cirral stages over time for a potential veg type. And this diagram that was developed by Ann Schliske is kind of the take-home message of applied departure analysis is where are you and where do you want to go? The assumption here is that you want to return to some approximation of that natural range of variation. And you can see as you go through the cirral stages, like in this hypothetical example, you're in deficit. So you have less early cirral than you did historically, so you want more. The mid-cirral close, which is typical of many of our landscapes now, are greatly in excess from fire exclusion. So we want to greatly reduce that. And that's the impetus for a lot of our thinning and treatment work. In this example, the mid-cirral open is about where it needs to be, and our late cirral open is severely in deficit, and you can think of classic single-story late cirral ponderosa pine as being severely in deficit, and it's our rarest old-growth type in the region. Okay, then, and then just to finish this slide, late cirral close is a little bit in excess. And so you proceed on your actions to get there. So what do we need to do all this? We need a potential vegetation map because we need fire regime. So the potential vegetation map will frame the fire regime for you. We need an existing vegetation map so we can classify it into cirral stages, and typically we use the gradient nearest neighbor, or GNN layer. We need some kind of landscape delineation, and we typically use HUCs and then match them to the fire regime. And we need some estimate of that historic range of variation. So where are we going? What's our boundary? And we get the reference conditions from state and transition models. Okay, and originally fire regime condition class was developed to get this metric. It's a simple similarity index. But over the years, we've refined that. This was a 2006 map of Oregon, very simple. But we began to get more sophisticated over time and refine the methods. This is the 2013 assessment at the request of the regional forester. This helped justify east side restoration. Then Haugo et al. 2015, when we began to look into what actual treatments do we need to do. And that resulted in these maps where we could identify both needs for disturbance and succession. 2018, we filled out the west side as well. And then this year, to support the bioregional assessment, we did the entire Northwest Forest Plan area, including Northern California. So in summary, you can use departure estimates. So from this work, we can identify acres in each HUC5 by potential vegetation type, by cirral stage, to identify what treatments we need to do, and we can even identify the order of treatment that's needed. Obviously, from those maps, you can set restoration priorities of where you need to go first, the why here, why now. And this is all circling back to that integrated landscape concept of the coarse filter. If you take care of the landscape, if it's functioning, then its parts are functioning. So this is a paper Cheryl shared with me, some guiding principles for landscape ecology in an applied context. Use landscape sustainability as an overarching goal. Check, we did that, in trying to get to a sustainable range. Use a broad ecosystem services framework. We have looked at this. For example, we could start integrating ecosystem services into the maps, things like carbon and water, and we're looking at that. Explore landscape history more comprehensively. That kind of gets to what Paul Hesberg was talking about this morning. We do, and I agree with him, we need to do more of that. How did we get where we are now? Consider climate change effects. There's been a lot of discussion this morning about the future range of variation. Use landscape models to support planning decisions. Check, this is based on those state and transition models. and promote a greater presence of landscape ecologists within agencies. And I think we've done that in this Forest Service region maybe better than any other. Quick lessons learned. Work with partners to get on the same page. Landscape assessments are successive refinements. You can see that in our work. It gets better. It gets more sophisticated. The old idea that all models are wrong and some are useful, I think we're getting more and more useful. Not to say that we're still not wrong. Allow different methods and approaches. And you know, we had a workshop a few years ago on what's the best method, and we never came to resolution. Let people do their own thing. If they end up in a good place, that's good. So to close, some suggestions for the planning teams. Be very clear on your objectives. We see this all the time where you're not really clear about where the document's going and you're trying to do a lot of different things. And so that's the first thing I always look when I evaluate a planning document. Are you being clear on these things? Do you want to reduce ecological departure? Do you want to reduce fire risks? They're not the same thing. Do you want to maintain a species? We had a lot of talks this morning about wildlife. What about invasive species, which we tend to forget about, but sometimes when you thin a stand, you're just encouraging annual grasses. So think about how these things interact. Use the tools available. Try to reinventing the wheel. A lot of this has already been done before. And then show clearly how your actions will further your objectives. And I see this in planning documents too. It's not a landscape strategy, just yard up your individual projects. Show me how they're moving the landscape towards a more sustainable state. Thanks.